In this video, we'll be talking about how to create a buttonhole placket for your garment. We'll be discussing things like button size, buttonhole placement, and even fabrication and what you need to consider with that. We'll even talk about the different methods used for buttonhole making, whether by hand or by machine. So I'll be right back with a closer setup so you can see what I'm talking about. Here I've created a sample placket. This is a standard placket. It's not a hidden placket. That's a little more fancy, where you have two layers that hide your buttonholes. So you essentially would have two flaps like this on center front, and this underneath flap would have your buttonholes, so when you buttoned your shirt, you would not see any buttons through the hidden placket. Now, when you are patterning your placket, you have to build in an extension, meaning that your buttons and your buttonholes are going to live on center front, but you have to have an amount of fabric that overlaps each other so the buttons can properly line up with the buttonholes without pulling it closed, right? So what I've done is created the side that the buttons will live on and the side that the buttonholes will live on. You can see there are lines that I've marked with center front, and both sides are exactly the same. I have a 1/2 inch for seam allowance. I have a dotted line for the edge of the garment, and then I have my center front line. And what I've done to this side where the buttons are going to live, I ironed this 1/2 inch back, and then I've folded it at the edge and ironed it as well, giving me a piece like this. So this one is a pretty typical size, like most button-up shirts would have. So I've got this layer under here that's about 1 inch thick, and it needs to be big enough to house the right size of buttons. You can choose that arbitrarily and then make your pattern fit that accordingly. And you refer to button size as lines. So you can have a line 40 button, which is 1 inch in diameter, and so on. So you go 36, 38. There's a chart. I'll provide that for you. So essentially, your two pieces of your garment, your left front and your right front, are going to live a little bit on top of each other. So you're going to have both of your center front lines lining up exactly like this. And I'm going to take this other side to the iron just so it's finished off and it looks exactly like this. Okay, so I have both pieces ironed and now they mirror each other exactly. The extension itself is very important because you have to have these two pieces of your garment overlapping, but also you have to build in this extra piece back here that's basically strengthening the edge of your garment. You want it to stabilize this area because there's going to be a lot of tension on it. You're closing your garment with buttons and buttonholes, so you want it to be strong. Some people will put interfacing in these sections. So you couldn't just extend your garment over a 1/2 inch from center front, turn it and sew it and call it quits. You have to have some sort of substance here in this area so it is strong enough to house this closure. And that can happen with a facing, but this is a built-in extension. Now, consider how these two pieces are going to live together. You want to decide the size of your buttons, consider the fabrication of your garment, how light it is, how strong it is. The smaller the button and the lighter weight the fabric, the closer together your buttons need to be. So let's say this is a typical button-up shirt and you have a button that is about this size, and in inches, this button is about 5/8 of an inch. Now this is a sew-through button, while if you have a button with hardware like this is called a shank button, and you sew it on basically the same, right? You're taking a lot of thread and just looping it through here and through your garment. But the sew-through buttons require a little extra step where you go through the holes and your garment, and then at the very end you want to wrap around the thread a little bit underneath and give it a little bit of height to it, a little stance to it, so it's not so flat and tight onto the garment that it's hard to maneuver. Like we were saying about the distance between your buttons, the lighter your fabric and the smaller your buttons, the more you need to keep the garment closed properly. So for this, I would do probably around 3 inches apart. And I would do that by measuring, say this is our seam allowance at our neckline. I would give myself a little bit of room from the top, maybe 3/8 to a 1/2 inch, and I would establish my first buttonhole. Then I want to come down exactly from the middle of that mark, 3 inches, and make my next. I'll do it with like a little cross mark, and then 3 inches, here's my next buttonhole. 3 inches, here's my next buttonhole, and so on. To get your buttons through, it depends on how thin the button is and how wide it is, the diameter of it. But also it's good to just test. See how big you need your buttonholes to be to let this button through. So I'm making my marks very perpendicular with this center front line at a very squared off 90-degree. And when you're marking on your actual garment, your final garment, you want to use chalk or a water-soluble marker that will wash away. And then I'll normally give myself little cross marks at the end of each buttonhole placement. A lot of times people will put their buttonhole placement right to the inside of the garment, leaving just 1/8 of an inch on the outside. The pieces are going to fight each other a little bit to come undone, but the button is going to live all the way on this side of your buttonhole because it's pulling apart. So wherever the end of your buttonhole is, that's where your button is going to live, the sewn shank of your button. So that's why most of the time. But there are some exceptions. So here is your buttonhole placement. Now the way to get your buttonholes, you have a few different options. So one, for a really fancy jacket or coat, a lot of times a tailor will do hand-bound buttons. You have to have a pretty substantial weighted fabric, like a nice wool suiting or jacket fabric. And this is done with a thicker thread, and it's almost like a blanket stitch, but it is a buttonhole stitch. Just know that is an option if you want to research that. The other super fancy buttonhole that we're not going to do is a welt button, and it's the same style as a welt pocket, where you have 2 pieces of fabric in a long rectangle like this, but essentially you're just making that into a tiny buttonhole, so it looks like this. It's very fancy, very time consuming, and you need it to live in between a garment layer and a lining layer. Now, you can do these buttonholes with machine, and if you don't have a home sew machine or an attachment for an industrial, that's the easiest. If you have an attachment, those buttonhole makers will do an automatic length for you, and it's very quick. Otherwise, you're going to take your home sew machine and take a moderately long zigzag stitch. You're going to reduce the length of your stitch to where it's just doing a tack, and you're going to sew a zigzag right in the same spot. And then you're going to move it to the side where you're doing a smaller width zigzag, and you go right around your mark like this with zigzag. And then you get to your end here, do another longer width and no length. It's doing another tack right here, and then come down the other side. Or you can start on this side and do another smaller zigzag down this side. Then you're free to cut this open on the inside, and that's your buttonhole. Now, if you don't have a home sew that's capable of zigzag stitch, then your buttonholes are going to look a little more crafty, although it is possible to make buttonholes. You're essentially trying to secure this fabric around your buttonhole. So when you cut a hole in your fabric, it doesn't ravel or fray. And you can do this by making a continual top stitch in a rectangle. So you would surround this mark that you just made with a straight stitch in this perfect rectangle. And you'd have to go over it like 5 or 6 times to really lock it in there. So it doesn't look as good as this zigzag version, but you can get it done, and it does work this way. So you would just take a straight stitch and go around several times, and then you can cut this open free. Be sure not to cut into your stitches because that defeats the whole purpose. And lastly, just sew your corresponding buttons to the other side of your garment. I like to quadruple my thread on my needle. Instead of just having a regular 2 threads coming out, I like 4 threads coming out, so I can make a hefty stitch much quicker, and my button sewing goes quicker. Now remember, the shank button is pretty straightforward. You can hide your thread knot on the inside of your placket, or just right under your button where it lives on this garment. So you would establish your button thread in the garment and then start sewing your button to it. If you're doing this sew through button, you would do the same thing, establish your buttonhole thread right where you need your button, and then start sewing through the garment. And remember, if you're doing a sew through button, while you are stitching through the holes, leave it a tiny bit loose. Don't hammer it down very secure. You want it to be a tiny bit loose, so at the very end you can wrap your thread around the stitches you made in between the button and your garment, and that acts as a shank like this. So instead of hardware, you would have a thread shank underneath this, and that allows the button to live a little bit away from the garment so you can maneuver it more easily through the buttonholes. If it's hammered onto the garment like this, you can barely get it up to maneuver it through the buttonholes. Okay, and that's the basics about applying buttons and a buttonhole placket to your garment. I hope that helps, and I will see you next with a zipper fly.